So, started with the online agitation against the finance bill as a trigger. And then it morphed into actually looking back at, so finance bill is seeking to raise these taxes. Why? Where is the money going? How is the money being spent so far? It actually became a whole conversation about the public finance management and people coming out into the street and saying, no, President, government, just do not bring this bill at all. President says, I hear you, Sawa, I will not sign this bill into law. Sawa. We will look at how we can better manage our finances. Okay. And people continue saying, all right, it goes beyond that. We still want to see action, heads rolling, action taking place. Can we see actual meaningful change in the way you've been doing things? And saying we still want to come out. But the people who were out yesterday, in many parts, are not the same people that we had seen 2 weeks ago. The people who had been covered in local and international media as, there's a new generation of Kenyans that are actually protesting, and they're protesting in a different way. They are putting across their message, and they are not violent. They are coming out, they're going back home. They are just picketing. The people we've seen on Tuesday last week, on Thursday, yesterday, are a different breed of people. They still look young. So what's happening? Is it that our Gen Zs have suddenly become violent? Is it that our Gen Zs have become so angry that they decided, our keywords, you're not reading placards. Let us torch tires. You're not reading placards. Let us rob from people. Is that what happened?
Yep, It is.
It's not what happened. So our Gen Zs are frustrated. They've become violent.
No. What we are seeing is that there is a group, and there are certain satellite groups of individuals who have infiltrated this larger protest group to bring about this destruction that we see, to bring about, in my opinion, a swaying of the initial narrative. It's not even a swaying, it's almost a toppling of the initial narrative. And that makes it seem as though young people, not even just young people, anybody who's been involved in the protest then, has left the original agenda and has now gone to a place of destruction of property and harming of people, which I purpose to say is not the case. That it still remains that there are still calls for people to say, we can protest in this manner, but that there is a deliberate introduction of criminals. That's true. That there's a deliberate introduction of criminals who've come to do some of the nasty things that we saw happening yesterday. And that sways 100% away from the original agenda. And it is deliberate. Why do I say it's deliberate? It is either that they have been encouraged or they have been paid, or either one of those two things has happened. But it is not the original plan for the protests in the manner in which they started last week. What we saw yesterday was criminal in nature. What we saw yesterday was definitely deliberate. It was planned and very different from those who came out to protest. That must be called out.
We've had protests before, and let's categorize them. The recent ones were the cost of living protests. And within those protests, there were peaceful moments. But then again, one witnessed the very sort of mayhem that we're talking of, where people had their shops vandalized, people lost property, there were damages. What we're seeing now is on a completely different scale. Completely different scale.
Yep. This thing has changed.
Yes.
It has turned. But how was it so easy to infiltrate such a protest?
If indeed it was infiltrated, the fact that those who began the protest were youthful, it became much, much easier to infiltrate. The reason is because who is it that you are going to find to be present at most rallies? It's usually young people, not old.
Yeah.
Who are you going to find who will be able to run around during demonstrations? It's young people. And then when you have a situation where you have unemployment rates skyrocketing as we do, where you have many young people, many who have gone to school, many who have some qualifications and have nothing to do.
Yeah.
It isn't as though you lack for a population to be able to give these protests the force and the presence of body that is required. By the same token, when we've talked about people looting and causing mayhem, there have been young people again.
That's
okay?
true.
So now, whenever we look at our politics and during the political seasons, one of the things that characterizes our politics is thuggery. We have entrenched this culture where it's like it's almost impossible for someone to be a budding politician or for someone who is a politician to retain their political position without engaging thugs. People who will either ensure that they disrupt someone else's rally, someone who on short call can beat up an opposition, or people who on short call can do the sort of things that would enable you to dissuade your detractors and to enhance your position. It has been an industry that has grown with time. Now, whenever we've had demonstrations, it's like the opportunity to actually practice or to apply the trade they have learned over time into practice. It's an opportunity for them to do that. Now, when you have one such as this one, which has grown and is all over the country, essentially what you've said, the hoodlum circle and the hoodlum brigade and the hoodlum unions have been unleashed throughout the country.
Okay, so let's take a step back. Let's call this band of people hoodlums.
They are hoodlums.
Gen Zs and millennials.
Yes.
Because they look like, that
They
age bracket.
are Gen Z
Zs
and they are millennials. That's the age group
Okay.
they're at.
Now, it has been said before that part of the reason why they are so easy to mobilize is because they are disenfranchised, they feel disillusioned, they have lost hope, and they have just given up on the system. So they've just decided, let's cool off from the system. Right? It has been argued like this before. Those who are either organized and used by politicians or whichever criminal elements to turn up in demonstrations, those who turn up in those demonstrations that have been organized by various groups, whether you say the civil society groups have organized a demonstration and you see some people who are ruffians and doing bad things, whether you say it's the Azimio demos, for example, last year, that you could see there were people who are ruffians who are doing this kind of things, the hoodlums who would participate in acts of vandalism,
yes, and looting and law breaking.
You could say that they have been taken advantage of by the political class, by those in positions of authority,
yes,
because of their economic situation.
Yes,
this conversation that was brought up by their age mates and their contemporaries, and assuming them also, was addressing this issue once and for all. Directly.
Yes.
Saying, you know what, we are no longer going to be taken advantage of. We are not going to be used. We are not going to be, sidelined in decision making. We want to participate in decision making. One would assume that those that have actually previously been so agitated and come out to participate in previous demonstrations would be the ones who see the message as, this is what we've been fighting for. Finally, we see others who are like us, who've been sitting back at home as we went out to fight and kunywa tear gas, now joining us. They'll be happy. They'll be saying, finally we have more people, we are getting to a critical mass that can force change on our own, right? But it appears that that's not the case. That there's still the hoodlum brigade is not buying this thing that this other iPhone, KFC, Gen Z brigade, Uber brigade. It's like we have those two brigades.
But are they not behaving that way influenced? That they have not come into the streets because they're not buying the same agenda as those who started the protest.
Were they in the streets earlier?
No.
So why not? Why didn't they join?
At the very beginning.
Okay. Or maybe ask this way. Do you think the hoodlum brigade was with the iPhone, KFC, Uber brigade 2 weeks ago in the streets?
No.
But you could not tell them apart because at this time they were not being hoodlummy.
If that was the case, are you saying that along the way then, that what we've seen is that they've been compromised in one way or another to now get them to start behaving in this criminal nature?
That's what I'm asking.
Or were they just at home, chilling, doing whatever it is?
Watching this.
These guys did not, these guys who are hoodlums or whatever, these guys who we saw yesterday doing this thing, they don't have a job. No, they don't have a job that they're doing somewhere and then somebody says, take a break and come and do this thing and then go back to your job. So what are we saying here? That they've been what do we say, compromised? Have they been paid? Have they been influenced to come and try to dismantle what has been a protest over the last 2 weeks?
And why would they accept?
Money.
Okay. So previously, they did not come out because there was no money.
Yes, no.
So
I
we are
mean, if
saying-
somebody doesn't make it worth your while, what are you going to go and do and start shouting and
Are we-
fighting?
are we saying
Somebody's
that
made it worth your while.
The guys who came out 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, were the bougie class. And these other guys did not join them. They're like,
Not necessarily, because not everybody, and that was the danger of the majority leader's statement.
Yeah, putting it into
that
class.
was the danger of his statement by
Yes.
trying
Yes.
to classify this thing. Because in as much as you did see people taking selfies and doing all that, there were a large number of people who maybe you want to see as maybe not even of that position that he described, because it was a wide array of different people from different social strata that nobody was even using that to identify them. And that was the danger in the statement that he
identification
made.
was that they were Gen Z.
The identification
That's it.
was that they were Gen Z. And the one strong narrative was that, look here, we are not satisfied with this kind of governance that is taking place today. Those were the two characterizations of these people who came out to protest.
Okay, let me ask the question
So
again.
now that's what I'm saying. The people who were introduced into this thing were folks, in my opinion, who were ready to take a little bit of shilling to come and disrupt this thing.
Let me ask the question again. The guys that we saw throwing stones at that restaurant in Mombasa, the one that we saw looting supermarkets, those ones that were there yesterday, because they were in their hundreds.
Yes.
Do you think they had come out 2 weeks ago, but they were peaceful?
No.
No.
Nope.
No.
Why
Nope.
not?
No. Let me read something that may shed a little light. This is a story from the Standard team in Mombasa.
Yeah.
Okay? Multiple interviews revealed. No, let me just start from Justice Mugure Thande also restrained police from extrajudicial killing, abductions, detentions, or torture of the protesters until the petition by Saitabao
Saitabao
Ole Kanchori is determined. Multiple interviews revealed that 3 groups of knife-wielding gangs were ferried into town where they roamed freely, attacking people and businessmen. Let me continue. A protester claimed that the individual behind the mayhem was a well-known political activist who was seen giving instruction to the gangs near Pandya Hospital. The activist directed the gang to attack a tourist who fainted and was rushed to hospitals. The attackers arrived in Mombasa CBD on foot, riding motorcycles, or were dropped off at Mombetari, said a police source. Okay? Mr. Kennedy Ikutwa, who suffered stab wounds in his arm, said he was waiting to board a matatu when the thugs confronted him. I lost my phone and shoes as the attackers, who also hurt me with a knife. It is like chaos was unleashed on us by the state because the police watched as they attacked. Mr. Uma said, the protest march went on peacefully in the morning with police escorting the protesters and keeping watch at a distance. 2 pickpockets who had attempted to steal from the protesters were beaten and forced to flee. Some day schools ordered students to go back home because their safety was not guarded. Now, from the story that I've just told you, this is a report from Mombasa. They say these people were ferried. It is, to answer your question, the protesters were going on with their business. Even if you look at, say, the city of Nairobi, ask yourself, when the protests begin, do we see violence immediately or does it take place sometimes after?
Sometimes later.
Precisely.
Yes.
So what does that tell you?
Yeah.
Because if indeed it's the same group who were violent, we would not even be able to come to work or leave work because they'd be in the streets causing mayhem. But when you leave work at a certain hour, you actually see them marching along with the Kenyan flag, walking,
Yep.
waving cars along,
Yep.
okay, waving at people.
Keep going.
That's what they do.
Absolutely.
So when all of a sudden, at a certain hour, there is all this violence,
You have to ask. And in as much as we're going to call out that the destruction and, things we're saying, violating and going into areas that are protected, which we shouldn't go to according to the law. Because what we're saying here is that regardless of what a protest is, that the rule of law must
Be maintained.
Okay? In as much as we're going to call that out, we must call this out as well. That it is very clear that as far as the human eye can see, that the agenda of the protest here has been stained. It has been.
Yeah.
Because now you want to make it seem as though, well, look at your protest, because that is what the castigators now began to say across board. You see, look at what you people are doing. And they lumped everybody into the same. Yeah, look at what your people are doing now. They've lumped everybody into the same pot. And we know very well, just like what you're saying now, that there was an introduction of this element later on in the day. And if you want to countermine this, just look at, again, that picture of that young lady who said, you know what? I came out to protest peacefully. I own a business here, but look, these people are now starting to rob and destroy. So I am going to defend my business. When I'm done with that, I'm going to go back and protest. So those elements have been introduced. We cannot run away from that. To then foil the agenda of this, which in its large majority was peaceful.
The narrative throughout was, we are peaceful. Someone wants to tell us that all of a sudden
the peaceful people have
suddenly turned violent and have suddenly turned to be procurers of mayhem and destruction.
Yeah.
Really, no.
These are the same individuals who, when a young man died, they covered him with the Kenyan flag and sang the national anthem and carried him off. These are the same individuals who, when a police officer is harmed, they go and take care of him. You want to tell me these are the same people who are going to turn around in the twinkling of an eye and start burning property and then violating and then pilfering from shops? Come on. Even if you have an iota of sense, you would be able to see that this is not the same strain of people, and that there is a deliberate move behind this to then besmirch the character of this protest. It is clear.
What everything that we are saying and what we are reading seems to point to, there's a deliberate attempt to ensure that the protests are given as dark a hue as possible, so that it's no longer a peaceful process. These are destroyers of property. These are people who are harming others, so that the action then that will then be mandated to be taken against them will have been justified by whatever narrative has taken hold. Because the narrative, once it is changed, and we're now saying these are violent people, these are destructive people, these are hooligans, because that's what it is.
Yep.
Well, that's the narrative that seems to be propagated.
Yep.
So now, when the strong arm of the law, operative word here, strong arm of the law, is now put in force, there'll be justification. And it's like the justification is being built. Yes. There is a picture on page 10 of the Director of Criminal Investigations. 40 individuals, pictures of them taken. Okay? They're saying wanted suspects. The individuals whose images, photos appear below are wanted by the police for their unlawful activities during the Anti-Finance Bill 2024 demonstrations. We therefore advise them to report to the nearest police station for further police action. I see. Information on the whereabouts of any of the suspects may be channeled confidentially to the through the anonymous Fichua DCI hotline number 08007 22203 or the police hotline 999 or 991 or 112. Okay. Now.
And you have the faces there.
Oh, the faces are there. Some are little.
I noticed that one of them is, remember the video that was going round of one of the guys who was inside Parliament, and
yes,
he recorded a video saying, "Mr. Speaker!"
Yes, that gentleman.
But unfortunately, he's passed away. That's
so
what we were told.
Yes, I've been seeing that on social media. I haven't
We've
really
not been able to
confirmed,
verify.
No, it hasn't been verified. I've heard of that.
Yeah.
Well. Yes, I've heard, but it has not been verified as yet.
So one of those is the photo is there.
Now the question I'm asking myself is, okay, if you have these pictures and you know who these individuals are, all right, and you're asking them to report. I see.
You're given the first choice: report or we'll come for you.
Yes.
I can clearly see that, there's been a different angle that's been introduced to the protests, right? And clearly, and we've said this many times, the youth have been taken advantage of, the youth have been used to go and cause chaos in demonstrations, the youth, kuna watu wanatumia vijana wetu vibaya, okay? And that has been the conversation, because it's been assumed, or it has come out as the youth are so disempowered that that's the only thing to do. But this is an instance where the youth have actually empowered themselves. This is an instance where the Gen Zs and the millennials have empowered themselves. They feel empowered. They feel we are not going to be taken advantage of anymore. Are you saying that there's still a group of young people, Gen Zs and millennials, who did not buy into that whole nonsense about, now we've taken the power, now we have the power, we can change things.
They may
that they still want to be given 200 bob by a politician or someone of influence to go and cause mayhem.
I was looking at protests. Huh?
That they don't get their point here.
They do. I was reading about protests, and I was looking at situations across the globe where people, university protests, young people protests. I went back to as far back as 1968, and protests that were led by youthful people. I looked at protests that were led or that were organized to talk and to bring to the fore the problems of racism and so forth.
Yeah.
And there's especially the ones that one reads about in America, because America seems to have taken the cup for many of these protests. Police action, it is shocking how it mirrors the police action that we've seen here. It is actually shocking. Where media people are assaulted, not told to walk away, assaulted, okay? And also where individuals, in the name of the protest, break into shops and loot. Los Angeles is one of those places that faced not just protests, but riots, okay? Now, what we are seeing being introduced here are not protests. These are now riots. And with the riots came the pilfering, the breakages, the looting, okay? Even on the day that people went into parliament, did we not see some people looting?
It's true.
So, you cannot tell me that these individuals who are now causing mayhem are the same individuals whom we saw at the beginning of this protest. And the reason is this. If you look at the numbers of those protesters, the first time they came into the streets, let me ask a simple question. If all of them had gone on a looting spree, what would have been left of Nairobi City? A simple question. If all that whole group of people went on a looting spree, the CBD would have shut down. Not because there were people, there was nothing for you to do business with. But that didn't happen. Property was not touched. We saw it. We saw it on the first. Saw it on the second. When we talked to Boniface Mwangi, who was part and parcel of that group of people who were protesting, he told us categorically that their interest to go to parliament was simply to be at the gate of parliament, to sing their songs so that they could be heard as the discussions are going on. That is what he said.
Not to enter
No,
parliament.
that was not the agenda. Their plan was not to enter parliament. That was not the agenda. But the narrative is that these people had the agenda and wanted to enter parliament.
And to go to the armory.
And it was easy to spin that.
Yes, exactly. Just as it has been easy to spin that the idea of going to State House is that they may enter it. But they did go to State House. The protesters did go to State House. And they did have a conversation with the security forces, and they then walked away.
So this is happening, all right? And clearly, these peaceful street protests, peaceful, colorful street protests are getting infiltrated, and their name is getting tainted. So what should the peaceful demonstrators and protesters do next? Would you say that they organize another street protest like they've done, knowing full well the danger of it being infiltrated?
What they should do is announce that they are withdrawing from the protests and say, for this period of time, we are not going to be having these protests. Our agenda remains the same. We'll use other avenues to communicate our message, but for now. So that if we see anybody in the street claiming to be protesting, we know with clarity. Okay? But why do I say this? If indeed there is a need to arrest these perpetrators, it will also give the security forces an opportunity. Instead of saying that you're dealing with a protest, there is no protest to deal with. Okay? So look for the people who have perpetrated these crimes and let them face the full force of the law.
There appears to be a challenge here, though, that because this thing is leaderless, right?
Who do you tell?
Who is this who's announcing that we shall not? Look at what happened. When Hanifa said, guys, we have gotten our win, let's take our win. Do you see the kind of pushback that she got?
Yes.
Still online.
Yes.
Being told, you're a sellout, get out.
Yes.
Compromised.
We have been compromised. We are going back onto the street.
That is perfect. They have gone back into the streets and here we are. So the same message needs to resonate again. If you wanted to achieve a certain goal, okay?
Yeah.
And that goal is being besmirched, it is time for you to say, let us withdraw.
Tactical retreats.
Yes, you haven't given up. You're saying, our agenda is being interfered with. Let's pull back. Because this is going to be us, and it's actually not us who are doing these things. Because whether you say you're not involved and somebody has lost his business, he still blames it on the Gen Z.
Yep.
Yes. So don't be part of a process that can be hijacked or has already been hijacked and which will definitely be attributed to you.
Because what are we saying? That essentially, right now, with the destruction of property, because we're talking about, a loss. We're talking about things that didn't need to happen, but obviously did as a result of these criminal elements that were introduced into this whole thing. That people will then take a blanket judgment on everybody and say, well, it's because of this Gen Z protest that my property has been destroyed.
Yeah.
It's because of this Gen Z protest that my shop has been broken into and things have been stolen. So that is the image that will be given to this protest, and that would be, if you ask me, hugely unfortunate because that was not the agenda from the very beginning. And that for the first time it showed us, though, look, that the people can actually raise their voices and talk about how their representation has been skewed, and that somebody would listen and then involve the people in the process of governance. Because essentially that was the initial cry, was it not?
It is.
That here we are with this thing that is going to affect our livelihoods. And we are saying, in the decisions that you make, as you represent us, how about you have us part of the conversation and let us tell you where the pain points are. But that doesn't seem to happen. And that life already being so difficult, now with this new raft of measures of taxes that you want to levy on us, it is going to make life all the more harder. And people saw an opportunity finally to say, you know what, let us be involved in this conversation. And we are going to march peacefully in the streets until you hear us. It worked. You hear what I'm saying? It worked to the point whereby, okay, well, we hear you. Now, the mechanics of all of how this will be activated are also pain points for people. But if we're looking at the agenda in terms of what it sought to fulfill, it did. What we don't want at this point is a situation where anything else is going to come to remove the victory of that agenda. And this thing that we saw yesterday is doing exactly that.
Exactly.
It is. Now, to continue to say that we're going to keep pushing against these things, guess what? The individual or the individuals who had the mind to pay people, to influence people to come and cause mayhem, it only gets hotter for them. For them, it's nothing. They're going to pay money. They're in a coven somewhere hiding, safe.
So they think.
So they think. But they're throwing this fire in. And I think that a protest must be. Because this kind of protest or this push for citizen-centric governance or this push for proper leadership, it cannot be just a protest affair. It has to be sustained. Yeah, we have to continue to keep governments accountable. We have to insist on right governance. We have to insist on citizen-centric governance. We have to insist on right leadership. It is not a one-day thing. Somebody reminded me of the protests in Egypt. And why were they sustained for so long? Because there was a community building of ideas. There was a community building of agenda and saying, you know what, guys, let's keep adding to this wall. Let's keep adding to this wall. Do we know when to retreat? Do we know when to turn the thing around? Do we know when to now add more force or more fire? And I think it needs to be looked at from that lens. Because if we say, no, we're going to go back tomorrow, we're going to go back tomorrow, we're going to go back tomorrow, guess what? The people who are introducing these criminal elements, they have the same mind. And they're saying, okay, you want to bring it. El mano, let's go.
But how about
It
then dealing with those
reduces
ones?
the potency of the original agenda. It does.
In Egypt, there are reports, and there were reports even then, that as the protesters continued increasing on the streets of Cairo, Alexandria, and elsewhere, there were goons that were unleashed by those in power. Known gangs, those drug militias that usually exist with a tacit understanding
They are known.
of the administration.
Everyone knows them.
Yeah, these are the chinkro. We know they exist. They are not so harmful. They are useful at some point. They were unleashed, but the people continued pouring out onto the streets. And despite all those things, somehow they got their message.
They did.
There will be those radicals, not radical rascals, not radical saboteurs, not radical looters and arsonists, but radical protesters who believe a cause, who say, a luta continua.
No matter what.
You shall unleash those goons on us. You will, at some point, you will not have money to pay them. But we will have the strength and the resolve to turn up. Now, how do you address those ones?
I don't know.
Because they're saying the way to defeat that is not to cower down. The way to defeat that is to come out and say, we are not violent, we are not looters. We shall come out. We shall be on Kenyatta Avenue. We will be on Kenyatta Avenue. We will not be on blah, 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 on Kaunda Street, or we will be on Kenyatta Avenue. From the beginning of it to the end of it, we'll only be on Kenyatta Avenue. So you, and of course the looters will try to come to Kenyatta Avenue.
This is it.
See?
This is it. Because that
They
message
say,
becomes very
do
popular.
not lose the momentum. How do you address those ones?
But Eric, the situation we have right now, why it is almost impossible for you to lose the momentum. The clarion call isn't made at a rally somewhere at a designated geographical location. No, the rallying call is made online, and it's constantly being made, and the communication is still ongoing. There's no day it actually stops. So even the things that we're saying here are still being discussed. Other issues are being discussed in small groupings and in larger forums. It's continuing. You see? This is the beauty of the communication age. So even as we speak, because what we are speaking also will also end up online. What we're saying now will end up online at some point. The question one wants to ask is if indeed those in the security arm of government understand and know that there are people who are infiltrating, they must know the channels through which these people are being marshaled, how they're being brought together, corralled, and how they're being brought in. Now, this is the question to them. What are they going to do about it? It's really very simple. Because one way of ensuring that this thing comes to a halt is that they deal with the genesis. All these people, where they're coming from, who is funding them, look for the funders. Okay? Now, if they don't do that, you see, the unfortunate thing about protests like this, they have a tendency of acquiring a life of their own. We are sitting here analyzing and looking at it and giving our suggestions, but you will find that because of the communications, some of which we are actually not aware of, just like these goons have formed into groups and they decide to come, the very, very groups of young men and women who are the majority, goons are a minority, they may decide things that we don't know about right now. They may have looked and said, our movement is being hijacked. There's something we need to know about it. If there's anything I've learned from this group of young people, is this. Their thinking is rather different from the way some of us think. No. They are not going to take this infiltration lying down. Now, that is where my problem comes in. Because if there are confrontations, and this is what I think the sponsors want.
Confrontations.
Yes, a confrontation.
A case like the one of yesterday where there are people who then say we are protecting our businesses, and then there are gangs who are coming and saying we want the business.
Yes, that is what they want. so that attention is drawn away from what the protests were for to now the discussion about hooliganism and how this particular our streets have become ungovernable.
Lawlessness.
Precisely.
And that will be the conversation.
Not only, no, it goes, if I take this as a logical conclusion,
The response.
what you're looking for, if this thing is countrywide, what does it lay the grounds for? A state of emergency.
And a proper crackdown.
Yes. Now that changes the complexion of everything completely. The moment you have a state of emergency, you will not be able to protest. It'll be illegal. It'll be unlawful. So why the taking a breath and taking a step back is necessary? If there are people on the street who are perpetrating what we are seeing, it will not be the protesters. You will know who they are and you can go and arrest all of them if you wish. Arrest all of them.
And I think that's why it needs to be looked at from that aspect. That there is a clear scuttling of the agenda. And it has to be looked at from that external eye to say, okay, guys, a minute. Because already, what narrative is being spun? Look at the folks who are in a position of influence, whether it is online or whether speaking in whatever circles. What is it now? That these protests, you see, all along, what they wanted was to lean on the side of hooliganism. That's it.
It has begun.
That is what it has already started. And it takes away from the integrity of what this thing was meant to be in the very first place. And I insist that there is not a thing wrong. In fact, it is encouraged for citizens to push for accountability when it comes to governance. It is imperative that the citizenry does that. It doesn't matter what age group. And there will come a time where you have the masses who are insisting that things be done right. But when you get to the point whereby, whether it is alleged or not, that there are certain individuals who don't want to be held to account, who want to throw in a criminal element to this thing, at that point you must take a step back and say, hold on a minute. The agenda is being scuttled here, and this is not what we want. How can we continue to push this message away from this criminal element? And that is what has to be looked at right now. We can't run away from the reality.
So what I'm hearing you guys say is there needs to be a loud and amplified voice by very many people who say, we are not going onto the streets.
Yes.
We are not going physically onto the streets.
We are not going to be represented by
Those that do not belong to this group, let them come and say, not streets. But we shall be on the X streets, on the social media streets, on all these other platforms. We shall be there. We shall appear in church. We shall be there. We shall appear in, we shall be there. We shall have the same conversation.
We shall sustain
this. We shall
this.
sustain this in other ways and forms.
Yes.
As we think of how else we can physically appear.
Yes.
I remember one of the first things I felt when I saw this, and you guys know, that I was like, finally, there's a voice that's coming out, and it's coming out. And I said, it must be sustained. Now, the sustainability of this narrative doesn't have to be in the same form through and through.
No.
And that's what we're saying, that you do not take away from the potency of the message because you are saying that the mechanics of the message should change. You're not removing the importance of the message at all. But you're saying, you know what? These guys have come to find us where we are on the streets. The message remains the same. Let's take it somewhere else where there's just as much strength in numbers, where there's just as much strength in message, and we can still push for this thing. Governments have been influenced by what happens digitally. We see that. We know it. And that's a space whereby this very same group of people is very well versed. I would not want the protesters who have this clear message, and it's not just the people who are on the street. There are folks who've been saying, look, let's hold government accountable over and over again. I don't want to see anybody hurt. I don't want to see anybody's image besmirched. Nobody should have to go into hiding. Nah.
But remember, even as everything that we're saying has taken place, there are many people whose livelihoods, not by the vandals, there are people who are in politics and the people who have preferred the status quo. Their livelihoods have been interfered with. Their statuses have been interfered with. There's a threat to the position some of them hold. This is a shift from something they had planned. Some can't even go to their rural homes, can't go to their constituencies. These aren't people who are going to sit back and just let things continue that way. No. they will be very happy to be enjoined in a situation where these entire protests are given as dark a name as possible.
But there are very many other platforms, like you've said. There's, for example, let's say if you're saying pushing for the immediate constitution of the IEBC.
Yes.
You know, there's that. There's you watching and clearly saying that we know the bill has passed at this stage and this stage. It's now at this particular stage we are expecting to see. And reminding constantly every day saying our agenda this week is sign the IEBC Act into law. Form the selection panel, or say no, take that thing back to Parliament and let us include the youth in the selection panel.
Absolutely.
Or more citizens in the selection panel. Reduce the number of political. I personally feel
Kenyans didn't
that
go
political actors should be the minority in that panel. But
Remember, Eric, Kenyans didn't go to Washington D.C. to talk to IMF. But IMF had them.
yes.
World Bank also had them.
Yep.
Yes. And those in positions of authority right now can hear you.
And you know, one of the greatest tools that you can use to fight anything is education and information. Let me tell you, there's a thriving of a certain kind of political class anywhere around the world that thrives on the uneducation and misinformation of the people. That because the people do not know, or because the people are uneducated about certain things, or even something as simple as people do not have the power of a vote. They thrive in such situations. And so what are we saying to sustain this thing? How about we even encourage people and say, you know what, guys? Voting, you vote based on information and education.
Register.
Register.
Look at the future. So how does this future look like? For example, how do we see Kenya looking like in July 2027? Right? If you're looking at July 2027, maybe one of the things that is to have more and more, the 8 million that had not registered to vote in the last election, plus the other 5 million that will be qualified to register by 2027, all 13 million register. As new voters.
Yes.
And those who had registered and did not vote, go and vote.
Go and vote. Then how do we build credibility around the IEBC? By making sure that the people who get into IEBC are people we can trust. Build the trust of that institution ahead of the election. All those things working one into the other.